You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we'll be listening to Licensed Characters and Media Properties as a Gateway to a Love of Literature, a session that was presented at Children's Institute 2024 in New Orleans.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. In case you don't know where you are, this is Licensed Characters and Media Properties. It is the third day, so I wouldn't be surprised. And a couple little housekeeping things before we get started. All slide decks and and I don't think we have a handout. I was going to say handouts. We don't have one. You don't get one. But the slide decks can be found on the app. Please make sure that you evaluate this session afterwards. Please evaluate every session you go to. It's really helpful for the ABA to get your feedback. This session is being recorded via audio and will be posted on BookWeb and the ABA's podcast, Booked. Please take a moment to silence all your cell phones and other devices. I am easily distractible, so for this to go well, that would be great. And we're going to do a Q&A at the end, so please keep your questions. But our room minder, very lovely room minder back there, will be running around with a mic. Please wait to start your question until she brings you the mic, because we want to make sure that your question is recorded for the podcast. Antitrust guidelines. We love you. Technically, you're in competition with one another. So read the things in bold that you've already read several times this week, but just a reminder. And now we can introduce ourselves. So I'm going to be your moderator today. I am Kai Berner, he, they pronouns, and I am the assistant manager, children's buyer, and gift buyer at the Bookroom of Edwards in Edwards, Colorado.
Hi, I'm Lily Taliaferro, she, her. I am the kids buyer and manager at Eagle Harbor Book Company on Bainbridge Island, Washington.
Hi, I'm Marissa Spence. I'm a bookseller at Ballast Book Company in Bremerton, Washington, and I also do like social media coordination, visual merchandising, and some event planning.
Hey y'all, I'm Molly Olivo. I am the book buyer, event coordinator, and occasional bathroom cleaner at Child's Play Toys and Books in Washington, D.C.
Perfect. All right, this is what we plan on talking about today. So you can glance over that real quick. But we, in general, are here to talk about the incredible tool to use in your stores, which is licensed characters and media properties. So we'll be taking some polls throughout the session, so be ready to answer some pop quiz questions. This is us. So I would like to pose a question to all the panelists. Is, from your childhood, what is your, number one licensed character that you latched onto with an iron vice grip?
I'll start. Mine is Cinderella, but specifically the Brandy edition, a classic, Whitney Houston. She was my go-to, still is. If I'm having a bad day, I will pull it up on Disney Plus and rewatch it.
Princess Belle, always, because she loved reading, and I loved reading, and I always felt like she was really headstrong, and I just could not get my parents to get me enough Beauty and the Beast books, costumes, toys, music, anything. So I love her.
So I have far too many of them, but I think officially at this point it's Godzilla.
Amazing.
Godzilla is my go-to.
And Molly went left field, so I'm going to also go left field. Smokey the Bear.
Hell yeah.
Everything Smokey touches in my lead your life by what Smokey the Bear would want you to do, and you'll not go astray too far. Who do we have in this precious little picture?
I think that's me.
All right, so quick attendee poll. How many of you carry books featuring Marvel and DC characters in your store? Perfect. How many of you carry Pokemon, Dungeons and Dragons, or Magic the Gathering? Brilliant. Bluey? Perfect. How many of you hear from parents that graphic novels are not real books and it's not real reading? Brilliant. How many of you hear that romance or fantasy or science fiction or insert other X genre here is not real books or real literature. Brilliant. We're going to give you a lot of really good ammo to shut those people down today. This is me with the love of my life, Smokey the Bear. So the first question I think I want us to talk about is, where do you all think the industry's overall bias, either internally or externally, towards carrying media properties stems from? Who wants to go first?
Okay. I guess it's me. So I think in the indie bookstore industry in particular, I think some of the bias comes from past quality issues. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but if you are a frontlist buyer and you've gone through the catalog and gone, I swear if this rep shows me one more early reader book that has no author, that's an extra $1 more expensive than the rest of them, because it has Bell or something on it, I'm going to lose my mind. Has anyone had that experience? Is that just me? Okay. And I think that bias is something that is less founded these days because they're using real authors to write these things now rather than, whatever copy editor was standing there that they did 15 years ago.
I think also the birth of a lot of these characters did not come from literature, so they don't see it as a literary character, whether it's, thank you, whether it's Spider-Man or Belle or or a Star Wars character. Yes. So they just immediately just don't associate it with literature or books or anything, and they just can't get past that little bias in their head.
The other thing is, originally I think it was just a lesser quality, both in like its actual physical form of it was thinner paper and it was easier to tear apart. So it became this sort of gross thing that nobody wanted. And so we therefore had a view of it being less than.
Sure. I think a lot of times, including what one of the former managers of the store told me was, well, if you can buy it at Target or Walmart, I don't think we should carry it. Which I hear from other people in the industry too. It's like, well, if the big stores are carrying it, it's not like unique enough for us and they can go somewhere else to get it. And to that I would say, but why don't we get their money here? Right? Like if that's what they're looking for, why don't we have it? So clearly a multi-layered problem here. So one of the really, really awesome things about media properties and licensed characters in general is that it's often a child's first real engagement with reading, especially reading independently. So those like early little Penguin readers, or those little golden books, or they have the loudest motorcycles in the city, I swear. Or like any of those little things is often the first step towards independently reading for children. And we all know as booksellers the really strong elements of social emotional skills and learning that these types of things can link. They're often kind of rudimentary, but that helps formulate bonds like cause and effect, teach conflict resolution, teach kids kind of the process of character development, and increase their social bonds. The other thing now that's really cool, kind of like what Molly was talking about, is that a lot of really prominent children's book authors are now writing media properties. If you haven't read Jason Reynolds' Miles Morales books, you all should. They're phenomenal. They're so great. Alan Gratz, Nick Stone, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Black Panther run. Do yourself a favor. My buddy Marco Shiro, obviously this was a very preliminary list because this is like 15 of them. But so it's really great that all these people are branching into these different characters and taking these really familiar characters that kids know and love, and running with it. So to kind of build off this idea, Lily, why don't we start with you this time? Go the other way. What do you think is the role of imagination and play in this kind of like social development in terms of relation to media properties?
Yeah, so I was a teacher for 10 years before I started being a bookseller. And so I saw a lot of my fourth graders and preschoolers really into like Paw Patrol and Bluey. And I am actually going to steal a story that I heard yesterday from someone of that they have a niece or someone in their life, and their only like way of communicating is through these characters. And I think it's really important to remember that like this is how kids that age are social, and it's how they make those connections with friends and with teachers and with other people in their life. And I'm gonna say, like, as long as they're reading, that's the most important part. Does it really matter, like, whether or not it's real literature or not? So I think it's super important that they have those spaces and they can make those connections.
Yeah, I also agree. Like, as long as they're reading, and you know, I think imagination and play really gets them into reading. So, I have quite the history with being a children's entertainer. So I would go to birthday parties dressed as Princess Anna, Belle, Ariel, Elsa, and one of the big things we would do at these events was story time. And you would sit there as, you know, Belle with a big ball gown and a big picture book on your lap and read to the kids for 30 minutes. They would just sit there and be engaged the entire time, and you would have so many parents coming up to you after saying, I can't even get my kid to settle down for a bedtime story, but because you're their favorite character, they're so happy to sit there and listen and engage with the story and the book that you're reading. And we would go to bookstores and do readings, and it just seemed to really help the kids engage.
I also think it's important to note that, like, in early childhood development, you're not just talking about, like, reading. You're talking about understanding the physicality of a book that you read from left to right, that the story has a beginning, middle, and end. And they're learning a lot of that through these characters. And we live in a world where kids are going to watch TV. I fought it really hard with my own kid, and then COVID happened. But I think it's one of those things where, like, we just sort of have to acknowledge that this is the world they live in. Even if they don't watch any of the characters, they will know who they are. My son had never watched any TV and could name every single member of the Paw Patrol. I don't know who told him, but it just, like, it was sort of like by osmosis, he had absorbed this information from some other child he had seen. But that was also him learning. He had a social interaction to learn those things, which is important developmentally. He learned about the characters, he could remember them well, and he could tell you stories about them. He would say, Ryder had a problem with this, and then Rubble brought the truck here and did this. And all of those things are really important for developing literacy skills, but also just for being a human. You have to learn all of those things somehow, and these recognizable characters like eliminate one of the barriers of entry to those social interactions.
I think it adds a level of comfort as well, because you have the 8x8 books that go on the spinner, and they're just essentially the same as an episode or as the movie, and so it adds a level of comfort for those kids who are reading it, and they're like, oh wait, I already know this story, so I'm not going to get lost while I'm doing it.
Yeah, and I think that element in and of itself, it helps increase comprehension skills and comprehension gathering, because they kind of already know the story, so they can look at other clues like, you know, visual clues in the images or how the story is structured, and kind of start to parse those things out. Even if they don't really know what it is they're learning, they start to like pick up on those different clues. And I think the social emotional piece is huge. So I have a 5-year-old niece, and I was hanging out with her like a couple weeks ago, and I asked her how school was going and all this stuff, and she said that a boy was telling another boy that he couldn't do something because only girls did that thing, right? And she's 5, and I'm like, I'm glad to hear that programming is still happening so young. But I was like, so what did you tell him? And she said, well, I told him what Sophia told me, which is that girls and boys can do anything. And I was like, oh, is Sophia one of your friends? Like, I don't know who Sophia is. And she went, no, Sophia the First. And I was like, oh, well, thank you for giving me a nice handy story to tell on my panel in a couple weeks. But it was so cute because she had like seen an episode of Sophia the First in which Sophia was like, "Don't tell me what I can do because I'm a girl. Princesses are just as good as princes." And then she like Uno reversed this kid and was like, "Princes can do whatever princesses can do." And I was like, yes. Little social justice warrior. Sophia the First, apparently. Winnie the Pooh. This is precious. Okay, so we are all here for a lot of different reasons, and one of those reasons is to be a profitable and sustainable industry. So we kind of can't get around talking about how licensed characters can impact the growth of your own business. Licensed characters are, as we said a couple times, like some of the first characters that kids really latch onto, the first characters that kids really see and relate to. And early fandoms have shown to have an impact throughout a person's entire life. So the things that they really liked and gravitated towards when they were little just continue to impact them as adults. And fortunately, fandoms are aged now. So a kid can like Spider-Man from the time he's like 3 until the time they're like 50. And there's stuff for them to read. Because of this, fandoms move product. Having these things in your store is not only beneficial for your customers and the children that you encounter, but it's beneficial for your bottom line. So panelists, and Marissa, maybe we'll start with you because I haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
What has your store seen in terms of sales and growth related to licensed characters and media properties?
Yeah. Well, we have a really small store, so you can overhear every single customer's conversation, which is fun and terrible. We have a kind of a big Bluey display in the back in the kids section in the corner, and I swear I hear multiple times a day people kind of walk around and look between the shelves and go, "Bluey!" Like, of all ages, but mostly small children. And then 5 minutes later, they are walking up with their parent with a stack of Bluey paperbacks. I would say that is probably our most profitable licensed character. But the other thing that I think of too is like the little golden books, which essentially makes their entire living off of branded characters and telling old stories and new stories. And people, I would say they buy quite a few of those too. And again, like that is their entire basis, is stories based on characters we know and we love, and people do immediately gravitate toward those, and they get really excited when they see them.
Lily, do you like Bluey?
I am a little bit obsessed, and I will be honest, I do not have children. I have 2 dogs, and I will sit there and watch Bluey all day long. As you can see, I'm rocking my Bluey shirt today. But it is such a comfort for both kids and adults. I will be honest, I will cry at the end of an episode because it hits. It hits home, it hits all the feels. And like Marissa, we also have a very large Bluey display. I think I maybe have 2 or 3 in the store now because I have last year's and this year's. And it is so exciting to hear parents and kids come in going, "Bluey!" The other one is Dungeons and Dragons has become such a huge thing, especially with all of the movies. And like Kai was saying, like, you have it for all ages. You have it for the Golden Book readers all the way up through like adult sci-fi novels. And I think those are so cool, and they've been super popular.
I also think, have any of you ever had the experience of having someone go, "Oh, I didn't realize people in an indie bookstore were nice"? Has anyone ever had that experience? Or like someone's like, "I thought everyone at indie bookstores was really snooty." And to be honest, our industry has earned that reputation many times. But I do think licensed characters are an opportunity to say, like, we are meeting you where you're at. If your kid is obsessed with Bluey, I'm not judging you for letting your kid watch TV, especially Bluey. We all watch it, like, you know, Bluey's life. But I think there is this opportunity with licensed characters for kids to be able to say, like, we accept your kid where they're at. We're going to help them in their literacy journey. We're going to be there for you, even if all they care about is Super Mario, and my kid only cares about Super Mario. So you can end up in these moments where you can make someone feel seen, you can make someone feel safe in your store and accepted, and it also gives you the opportunity to upsell. I'm sorry, but if you bought them like 10 beautiful hardcover picture books and then you walk up to the counter and there's a Bluey book and they're like, I want that one, what's $5 more? And that's a $5 bigger sale, or $6, I think now, whatever. But I think there's so many opportunities. And did everyone go to the Circana session yesterday? I feel like one of my biggest takeaways from that was like licensed characters, like the evergreen licensed characters are a really solid opportunity for growth. So that's something we should all be paying attention to.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's Belle. That's crazy.
That's so weird. How do we get that childhood picture of the Disney character Belle?
Yeah.
That's weird. And now talking about equity and access. So the overall licensed characters have a lot of backing from the people that produce them. Disney is really invested in making sure that Disney princess books continue to do well. They're really invested in Marvel doing really well. And so there's a lot of ways that they show that. It's lower price points, it's quantity of titles, it's, for better or worse. I think they're getting better, personally, making sure that diverse characters are represented. Obviously, there's still so much distance to travel on that one, but incrementally, we're getting better. And more importantly, they're fun. Who sells the crap out of Dogman in your store? Okay. I had a parent who was really snooty about their kid liking Dogman. And I said, well, actually, they were like, I'm so sick of it. We have so many, and now there's a new one, and I just don't understand why they're so popular, and I think they're so stupid. And I was like, well, it's actually really cool because your kid's reading a classic novel. And they're like, no, they're not. They're reading Dogman. And I was like, yeah, that are all based off the plots of classic novels. So your kid's actually reading, like, The Sun Also Rises and The Scarlet Letter, but there's a dog and a cat, so they like it. And they were like, I had no idea. And I was like, have you read them? Or did you just not like them because there's a cartoon dog on the cover and it's illustrated? Which I think also goes to the equity part. I think licensed properties generally, including, especially graphic novels, I will die on the graphic novel hill. But I think that like graphic novels and licensed properties in general have such a lower entry point for kids. If kids are reluctant readers or they have reading struggles, there's less words, there's more pictures. There's no quicker way to make a kid hate reading, I think we all know at this point, than making them read something they don't want to read. So giving that reluctant reader that low access point, I think, is so incredibly important. Back to you, Molly. Do you have any other thoughts?
I mean, I think from an access perspective, having things at the lower price point is really what it boils down to a lot of the time. And being able to say, like, you may not be able to afford the $21.99 hardcover picture book, which we've all been going at all season, but this $5.99 paperback is much more accessible, and there's also a higher chance that you're going to like it because we already know that you are attracted to these characters. And I do think there are certain licenses that have done a really solid job of having a more diverse cast. Like the Gabby's Dollhouse stuff is really nice, like having a black girl front and center on the cover of every single one of the Gabby's Dollhouse books. And whether or not, whatever licenses are popular in your area matter. But I do think having that there and having it be something that's like popular outside of the bookstore can really help make kids feel like they have some agency.
Okay, can we have like an honesty moment, you guys? Whatever we say in this room, doesn't leave, don't worry.
You're in a safe space.
Yes. How many of you have read fan fiction? Right, thank you. Those who didn't raise your hand, you're a liar. I'm just kidding. I love you. But my coworker and I were talking about fan fiction last night, and how it's so easy to just reach for a fan fiction because it's your favorite characters. Like, we're not kids, like we're grown-ups, but we reach for these stories that we already know the world. They're already our comfort characters. We know how things work, and it makes it so much easier to just delve into the story and the book, I guess, itself. And I was thinking about that in terms of this panel is, like, we should not judge or blame children for wanting to reach for those comfort characters, because we do it all the time ourselves, some of us, those who raised our hands anyway. And I just felt like that was really applicable, and it goes back to making it equitable for all the children. It just encourages those comfort characters on those covers, encourage every child to reach for any kind of book, and no matter the kind of book it's reading, we love to see it.
I think jumping off of that, it is a great starting place to then leap into other areas. So like my first thought with the fan fiction one is like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey. Like 50 Shades of Grey was Twilight fan fiction first. And so then that led into a whole new realm of books. So like Dogman and all of those and Bluey can lead into like Narwhal and Jelly. I see you. And all those other cute characters. Cloud Puppy.
Halftime. We're good.
Hi. Just saw you waving.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also in the same way that I have tricked myself into accidentally reading a fan fiction the length of War and Peace in like a day and a half somehow, never look at the word count on your fan fictions. You'll get really upset by how much you just read by accident. Like in the same way, you're almost kind of tricking kids into reading a lot in a subtle way, which is actually really beneficial, especially for the kids that are like, I hate books. And I'm like, well, do you like Spider-Man? Because this is a story you can't see in a movie, and it's Spider-Man content, and they're like, gimme. Also, if you ever want to talk to kids, and by talk to kids I mean be talked at by a kid in your store, figure out what character they like. I have a kid who I connected to a Dungeons and Dragons group in our town. And then I just gave him all these like stories and stuff that were the offshoots every time he came in. And now he comes in and just like follows me around the store for like 40 minutes, like a little duckling, just like telling me about his Dungeons and Dragons campaign and everything. And now I can be like, hey, here's this middle grade fantasy novel. It sounds kind of similar to what you're doing in your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And now we've got that kid from, like you were saying, from the media property to another thing that will just continue to feed into his love of reading forever. But I wouldn't know that hook if he didn't follow me around and info dump on me about Dungeons and Dragons for 45 minutes once a week.
I think also to note on that, especially with Dungeons and Dragons, is that they are learning storytelling and comprehension, especially with those, because they have to make their own worlds and make their own characters and follow them sometimes for weeks and months at a time. So it's helping them in other aspects of their life, not just their reading sort of lives.
Does anyone here other than me play Dungeons and Dragons all the time? Great, yes, my people. It is a lot. The way that I explain Dungeons and Dragons to people is as cooperative storytelling. You have one person setting up a world, and you have a bunch of people embodying characters and running around and playing them. And so you're writing, like Lily was saying, for days, weeks, months, years, an entire world and an entire story and an entire setting. There are a surprising number of novels that if you dig deep enough, the author will be like, yeah, I actually wrote this because this was my D&D campaign and I just couldn't stop thinking about it, so I wrote it down as a book and changed the characters' names.
Legends and Lattes is a major one.
Mm-hmm. Can't spell treason without T is another one. But come talk to me about Dungeons and Dragons after. I gotta cut myself off. But it's an amazing property, so if you don't have it, bring in a couple things. The gift buyer in me says bring in dice, sell dice. That's my subtle plug. Okay. Do we have any lasting thoughts before we go to Q&A?
Yeah. I think maybe we could go through and do our sort of this is what I tell parents when they are resistant to licensed products thing. I know in our store, I use my signature line, which is your child becoming a lifelong reader is more dependent on them enjoying reading than the quality of the literature they read or their skills.
Mine is not like that. I'm just kind of sassy about it. I'm just like, are there words on the page? Are they reading the words? Like, that's a book. And, you know, I just kind of, well, also sometimes like flip through, if it's like a graphic novel, for example, I will like flip through it with the parent and be like, look at this story we're interacting with right now. Isn't that crazy? It's a book. And then I'll be like, here you go, let your kid read it. A lot less eloquent.
I focus a lot on the joy. I'm like, look how happy they are. Like, this is what they want. And that's the important part, what makes them happy.
A lot of times I ignore the parent completely. Because that's my move. And I'm like, hey man, who's your favorite character? And they're like, oh my God, so there's this person, and then they do all this, and then they go here, and then these are all the names of all of their friends, and here's how they're all connected, blah, 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 blah. And I just kind of look at the parent. And I'm like, yeah, it really sounds like you're like really locking in all this information. Like you really understand the world and all the characters. And they're like, yeah. And then they went here, and then I was reading this other book about it, and this is what happened there. And I was like, did you know your kid has really great reading comprehension? And then I just let it sit. And then they're like, okay, I guess you can buy another graphic novel. Because I think that like a lot of times the disconnect is that once a kid starts reading independently, unlike when parents read them picture books, the books aren't necessarily getting read by the parents. So they look at it and they make a judgment call, right? For better or worse. And I think that showing them rather than trying, like you can stand there, in my experience, in front of a parent and be like, well, studies show that XYZ, and then I kind of see their eyes glaze over and they're not really listening to me anymore. So I think a really helpful tool that I found is just showing them the effect that these books have had on their child. Because that's, at the end of the day, what I care about, is that they just let their kid get the book they want and they swipe their credit card. Okay. Anything else? Perfect. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions. So please raise your hand, and our lovely room minder will come to you with a mic. As a reminder, please do not start asking your question until you have the mic in your hand. For those of you that don't like using mics, I need you to use it here, not here. Thank you. Anyone have a question? Rebecca.
Yeah, right. You did very well, thank you. So how much of your store, percentage-wise, would you say you devote to the licensed characters? And do you have them in every section, or do you pick and choose strategically where you put them?
I don't know percentage-wise, but we have a dedicated, I guess, sort of wall that we say is pop culture. And then every shelf is sort of like the massive ones. So like we have a shelf for all the Pokemon books and a shelf for all the D&D books, Dungeons and Dragons. And then we have a spinner that is, for the most part, all media characters, with a couple like Richard Scarry thrown in there.
Yeah, like I said earlier, we have quite the big Bluey display, which is like front and center, like between a couple shelves by a window. We also have a spinner with like all the little golden books on it. And then I would say the rest of it is kind of intermingled. Like we actually don't really segregate the pop culture books, I guess. But that it makes it easier for people to just kind of stumble upon like, oh, this is my favorite movie in a book. That's crazy. But then sometimes people do also come in and specifically ask for it, and then you have to go search for it. But yeah, I would say it's pretty mixed in.
Hi, I'm a data nerd. 8% of our book sales come from licensed products.
This is why we have Molly on this panel.
Like, do you want to see my spreadsheets? But we keep our licensed products pretty segregated. Like all of the licensed product early readers are together and organized by license. And we have these like plastic things that go in the shelves and stick out and say like, who, Spider-Man or whatever on it. And there is a chunk of them that's like assorted smaller licenses where it's, like Storybots do not have their own category, but they are there. But we also find like we also carry toys. So we have like almost 15% of our toy sales come from licensed products as well, which for us is pretty big considering that we do like Lego as well.
Yeah, I think for us we have 2 little like half shelves that are devoted to licensed characters. We call it, I think, popular media. That's how we label it. There's a couple exceptions, like all of our early readers are just all in a spinner together. And other than them being organized by level, I've decided I don't want to put in the energy to be as efficient as Molly is and organize them by license, which makes searching for them really difficult. But anything from just above the early reader all the way up to YA is all on those shelves together. Those shelves are organized by license, but it's like, Marvel, DC, D&D, Pokemon, Minecraft, all that stuff. And then the YA we keep with YA because teens don't like feeling like children. So they don't want to go looking next to picture books for their Miles Morales chapter book. So those are in just normal YA. So kind of the extremes are separated out, but then everything else is together for us. And I don't like math, so I don't have a nice percentage like Molly did for you.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question for you all. I'm from the publisher side, and I'm curious, I'd love to hear about your all's buying strategy for licensing, because there are a lot of licenses in this world, and one of the things that I experience frequently in meetings with booksellers is not all booksellers have small children, and not all booksellers are plugged into what actually matters to a lot of kids on this side of things. They don't know what shows they're watching. So how you decide what you're going to try in the store or what formats and what matters to you when you're selecting or trying out new licenses.
Okay, full disclosure, I don't buy books for the store. I am just a measly bookseller. Not measly, I'll take that back. But our owner, Kate Larson, she has the biggest ears and she's always listening, and if we suggest a book, then she'll usually get it into the store. I used to work for the Walt Disney Company, Lucasfilm, so I really keep tabs on Star Wars books and Disney books and Marvel. And if I see a cool book that comes out, I will just go to Kate and be like, I like this book, or I liked these characters when I was little. Get this book in. So I guess I just kind of keep tabs, again, on things that I love or things that I loved as a kid, which I think we talked about earlier. I feel like Kai, you mentioned that, about how these characters in these stories stay with us from the time that we're little. And if I know that another kid is gonna like it, I will suggest that she get the title in the store so that I can help introduce these worlds and these characters to another kid and help them develop that love. Yeah.
I do a lot of listening while I'm sitting at my desk because my desk is right back in our kids department. And so I will listen for what the parents and the kids are talking about. My fiance is a preschool teacher, so I listen to what he brings home of Paw Patrol is what's up. I don't know any of the characters, but I have all of the books because I know that those are super popular with that age group.
I think, and Maggie is my rep, full disclosure. I've said no so many times. But I think for us, we also, our booksellers keep track of what people ask for that we don't have. So if someone comes in and is asking for a book about a license that nobody knows about, we make a note of it. We have a spreadsheet that's they asked for it and I couldn't find it. And it's literally just random notes of I think it was called Wishing kind of stuff. And then I figure out what it actually was. But I also think there are certain companies that do best license-wise for us. Disney tends to do really well. And we've also found that the more educationally specific ones don't work as well. So there are trends that can help you inform which licenses work for you. For us, Paw Patrol does really well. The ones that are more social emotional themed tend to do better. So so when we're like looking at a new license we don't know anything about, we look at what the content is, and if it's like we're teaching the alphabet and counting, we tend to be a little more skeptical until someone asks for it, and then I just order them all.
Yeah, I think that like anytime you're dealing with a buyer who's unfamiliar with a certain property, as a rep, having as much information as you can about the trends and the popularity, because I don't personally know what as a buyer that's like, because I am a 12-year-old boy in my heart all the time, for always. So I'm like, that's cool, and then I buy that one. But I think that if you're dealing with a buyer who's just not quite as keyed in, suggesting some of these things, like, oh, well, between our next couple meetings, why don't you like have your booksellers keep an ear out for you, or something like that. Because I think that like being as keyed in as a buyer as you possibly can is obviously great. I think from a rep perspective, reps will talk me into or out of things. I always say a good rep is going to talk me out of something. And if they just talk me into things, I'm like, okay, maybe I'll use my judgment a little more judiciously on this one. But as a rep, I think you're a really great tool for the buyer to be like, no, this is massive. Bring in one and figure out like per license what the most popular title that you're seeing the most sales on in indie channels is, and be like, this is the one you go in on. And then like for me, my PRH distro rep was like, you should buy this deluxe volume of Berserk manga that's $50. And I was like, that's stupid. People buy manga because it's $10. And she was like, no, trust me, you need this Berserk manga. It's $50 and it's fancy and you need it. And now we have the entire series and we sell them once a week. So like having that thing that you're like really, that you know is gonna work, or that you think very strongly is gonna work, and just be like, just bring in this one thing, this one season, and next season we'll see how it did, I think is a really great tool. Because I think once the buyer sees the result and they see that they can trust you to send them in the right direction, you'll have more success in future seasons.
Can I add one more thing that I know Maggie knows, but maybe others don't? Making sure that the intended age for the book that they are selling is the intended age for the license. Mm-hmm. So if the license is targeting, 0 to 3 and it's a chapter book, maybe that's not the licensed product to bring in. But if it's a movie that's for ages like 4 to 8 and it's an early reader, that sort of, perfectly aligns with who's going to be looking for it.
Also, if you know that a movie or a series is coming out, you will sometimes know before we do. Mm-hmm. So making that note, be like, this is coming in the next few months, or it's going to be announced. Those are also really helpful.
And I do think keeping your recommendations as a rep strictly to the indie channel. Like I don't care how things are doing at Walmart or Target or Amazon. That isn't going to be helpful, actionable information. So parsing out your data as much as you can on how the actual indie channel is dealing with these titles is always super valuable. Yeah. And I think I saw a hand over here.
Also a publisher. So I wanted to know, when you hear from either your rep or either word of mouth, what's your first reaction? Sorry, I have an A and B kind of question. What is your first reaction to when you hear licensed? And then B, for your bookstore identity, do you gravitate more towards license or original content?
That's a hard question.
Sorry, everybody.
I think it. Oh, sorry.
No, go.
I think it depends. Our store really gravitates to Dungeons and Dragons, actually, because we have a board game pub right underneath us. So we have a lot of nerds in the area, a lot of people who play D&D. So we have a lot of D&D stuff, both merch and games and books. And we obviously gravitate toward Bluey. Star Wars, because I tell her to get Star Wars in. And But some titles I feel like we don't get a lot of, and we then, like, we also focus on the original fiction. I would say it's very 50-50 for our store, but I don't know if that's the same for everybody else.
I think if there's not a reason for it to be licensed, it doesn't need to be. Like, if it's like someone comes in with a really good book idea and you're going to publish it, like, you don't need to slap Elmo on it for us to buy it. But if there's like a cool idea for a book about Elmo, or like there's an episode of Sesame Street or whatever that, you know, seems like it would make a good story, like that we love and licensed. But we do, like, ordering wise, only 8% of what I bring in is licensed product.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that a lot of publishers will backload the license into the back half of the catalog, and so by the time I get there, I'm like, I can't look at 25 Coco Melon books. Their eyes freak me out, and I'm just gonna keep scrolling. But like, I think that a lot of times, like we've kind of alluded to, there's kind of this step back when you see license that's like, oh, these are the books I can scroll through really fast because they don't really matter, which is not my personal thing. But I think that as like a brand identity, each store is going to have a different balance of license versus whatever original content, I guess you could call it. But I think for us, I like having at least some licensed characters for every age. So like we have a pretty small sci-fi section because we have a lot more fantasy readers than sci-fi readers in our area. But I still have some Star Wars books in there for adults, for kids, for every age, for accessibility. So I think like as a brand and as an entity, I want every single person, no matter what they're looking for, to feel like they can find something adjacent to their passions. And so I try and like pepper it in throughout our whole store. Did that kind of answer your question? Okay, great. Did you have any thoughts, Lily, at all?
I was just going to say that I pretty much trust the ones that are like tried and true, that have been around for a while. If there's something new that I haven't seen, then I'll sort of pull out what people think if they've heard it, and then I'll do my own research, and if it's something that I think fits within sort of my community, then I'll bring it in.
And I think we have time for one more question if someone has one.
Hi.
Hello.
I just have a quick share about when my son started kindergarten, and he learned about Pokemon and taught himself how to read with those giant Pokemon Essential Handbooks. I mean, and every edition. I mean, it was awesome. My question, and we cannot sell enough Bluey. It just won't stop. I just have a question if any of you work on book fairs, and how do you communicate with the schools about bringing in licensed characters? Because that, I mean, great price point for book fairs. I just would love to know your thoughts on that.
We do this a lot, and we used to have schools always say no. I think that was I think for the most part, when we get a new school for book fairs, a lot of times they're coming to us because they're really annoyed about all of the crappy stuff they got from a certain other company. And we tend to try to have the conversation of like, these are lower price point titles, the kids are gonna buy them. If you are interested in sales, we should have some of this. Of course, we will not make your entire book fair books that come with a Lego minifigure, but maybe having one isn't the end of the world, or at least having some early readers or like things peppered in. We find they tend to give the same response to that as they do activity books. Like it's like if they're okay with activity books, they'll be okay with having licensed characters, but sometimes it is a conversation. We have it we send a Google form with questions, and it's one of the questions on our Google form that says like, are you comfortable with licensed products if you have questions about it? And if they answer no, I send a follow-up email saying, just as an FYI, fairs that have licensed products tend to sell more, and this is all of the benefits. And sometimes they still say no, and we give up. But I think about 80% of our fairs now carry Bluey, and they sell through every single one of them every time.
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty equal amount of like licensed and then original fiction, but then we also have so many local authors in our area that we really, really focus on bringing their books or the author themselves to speak if we do a book fair at a school or a farmer's market or something. But I'm pretty sure she usually tends to bring quite a few licensed books along with the really hyper-local picture books and little kid chapter books and stuff.
All of our book fairs are held in store, and so we have some really great librarians and teachers that are fully aware of the impact that all the licensed characters have, and so when they have their school list, they actually will put them on their sort of wish list of what they want for their own classroom.
I don't think I've ever directly heard pushback from schools about licensed characters. I try and make it not an overwhelming majority, but you know, a few early readers here, a picture book there, and I don't think I've ever heard anything negative about it, because I think what our schools are really interested in is accessibility. I come from there's a very wide income gap in our area, and so a lot of the schools that we go into are lower income schools. So they're not going to complain about a $5 book for a kid. And it's but it is that conversation of like, what is the school looking for? Are they going to prioritize a low price point overall? Do you need to bring only paperbacks and only media properties? And so kind of to Molly's point too, I think that's a initial conversation about the actual school's expectations and what they feel like their needs are, and then kind of figuring out where you can fill those and where there's area for a little pushback, or because ultimately I think you're the professional at the end of the day. Like you're the one who is the bookseller, and so I think if you can kind of meet the school where they're at, but then do a little pushing, like Molly was saying, where needed, to be like, actually, this is the better option for you. I think it's good. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you for listening to Book to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!